Hi there, welcome to a rather vertical form of IndyCar today on the 10th of December. And you might be wondering, why on earth am I shooting this in portrait rather than horizontally using the landscape format? Well, the answer to that lies with Facebook's phone app. They have changed the whole system around so that you can no longer actually broadcast live streams in anything other than this format, which is really, really annoying. If I wanted to do a program with a horizontal format, I would actually have to, well, basically uninstall the current app and try and reinstall an earlier one, which is really pretty difficult to do and takes a long time. So anyway, here we are in this vertical format, which I find extremely annoying, Facebook. Anyway, to today's news, and to be honest with you, it's, again, hard to find anything positive to say about what's going on in Scotland at the moment, as you can imagine. But I wanted to focus a little bit on what has been happening to Scotland's government legislation over the last few years, whilst the SNP and the Green Party have been in an alliance government. Now, the last series, or the last in a long series of Scottish laws, which have been struck down by the United Kingdom, happened in the last few days when the United Kingdom's interference in the Gender Recognition Reform Act has now basically trashed that particular piece of legislation as well. Now, it's not the first time that they've done this. Of course, there have been a lot of different pieces of legislation passed in Holyrood and subsequently abandoned, either because they were deeply unpopular or simply because the British state decided that we weren't allowed to do it. And if you go back in time a bit, let's say you go back even before we actually started talking about referendums and Nicola Sturgeon going to the Supreme Court, there was, of course, a number of bills, or there were a number of bills, which caused a lot of difficulties, mainly for Scottish businesses. One of these was the ban on scallop dredging in certain areas of maritime protection. And that was very quickly shot down because it meant that scallop fishermen off the west coast of Scotland and in other places as well were not going to be able to make a living anymore. And so very quickly the Scottish Government realised that that particular piece of legislation, although worthy and was being done for the right sorts of reasons to try and protect some species in the marine environment, was in fact going to cause a major problem for rural communities, particularly where scallop dredging is actually performed. Now, scallop dredging in Scotland is not done on an industrial scale. It's done more or less on a sort of cottage industry basis, so it's not a massively damaging form of industry. So that was one of the first laws that got nixed. You may also remember way back a bill called the Continuity Bill, which was designed by the Scottish Government to make sure that whatever laws we had from the European Union whilst we were in it carried on into Scottish law after Brexit. Very quickly that was shot down by the UK as well, using whatever devices they had at their disposal in Westminster to do so. The so-called Continuity Bill would have made a lot of laws which existed at the time we were in the European Union Scots law, even though they would not apply in the rest of the UK. And because the United Kingdom is able to add and amend its own bills, they just added a catch-all clause to their own, basically their own Brexit bill, which made this unlawful. And so that was the end of that as well. And if you go back even further, you might remember that the Scottish Government used its local laws to stop fracking in Scotland. Now, it was kind of badged as a fracking ban, but effectively it used Scottish internal legal processes for things like planning and environmental controls to actually stop the companies from drilling for gas in the Scottish mainland itself. And they could only do so if they could prove that it was entirely safe and wasn't likely to pollute the groundwater around the site. Of course, nobody could really guarantee that, and so effectively it became a moratorium on fracking. However, even that law has eventually been challenged by the United Kingdom. And that brings us to unit pricing for alcohol, which has been a kind of qualified success under the Scottish Government. Again, it's not proving to be as popular as they thought, nor has it proved to be as effective in fighting the ravages of alcoholism. In fact, the causes of alcoholism are probably more important than the alcoholism itself. The reason why people were getting into alcohol was simply because they had no hope, they had no jobs, and they lived in perhaps housing estates where there was no access to any amenities and people were living on benefits. And what do people do in that scenario? They tend to turn to things like drugs, to drink, smoking, all the things that we know are bad for us but give us a level of oblivion, a way to shut out the bad stuff that's going on around about us. So although the law on alcohol unit pricing made certain high alcoholic content drinks very, very expensive, any serious alcoholic would just simply find a way around that. So that was another bill which, although I don't think it fell completely, it was a bit of a damn squib. That brings us up to things like the gender reform or gender recognition reform bill, which became a law and was passed by the Scottish Parliament, only to be challenged by the United Kingdom Supreme Court, and then it went to the Court of Session in Edinburgh, where they ruled that the Supreme Court had it, basically, that the Gender Recognition Reform Bill put Scotland at odds with laws on gender recognition in the rest of the UK and therefore struck it down. So that was another great failure of legislation. And it seems like the Scottish government under the SNP and the Greens have sort of lurched from one to another to another to another of these, I would say, these central key policies of the Green Party, and particularly the Gender Recognition Reform Act, which was really a condition of their involvement in the SNP government in the first place. So now that the Gender Recognition Reform Bill is basically being destroyed by the United Kingdom, it seems that there is little point in trying to fight it because A, it wasn't popular with the population of Scotland, although it passed in Holyrood. The politicians were extremely keen on it because it ticked a lot of boxes and it created an ease of changing gender, which wasn't there before. But it also removed some of the key protections for women and girls, which were that anyone wishing to change their gender at first had to have a medical diagnosis of body dysmorphia, which is basically the condition where somebody is born into a particular sex or gender which they feel isn't them. They feel like a woman, but they're born into the body of a man, or vice versa. And because anyone who wished to change their gender legally had to get this diagnosis, it did provide a burden of proof before anyone could actually call themselves a different gender from that in which they were born physically. So at the end of the day, what has happened really is that all of these policies, which many of which were, I think, organised or certainly proposed by the Green Party and agreed to by the SNP, have basically taken all the spotlight off some of the most important constitutional issues of the day. And we know also that because Nicola Sturgeon took the issue of the Constitution and the right of the Scottish Parliament to hold referendums on anything that we liked, including whether we stayed in the Union, the fact that she took that to the Supreme Court and they ruled that the Scottish Parliament doesn't have the powers or doesn't have the competence to hold a referendum on ending the Union, set back the cause 10, 15, even 20 years. So my question now is, how does all of this affect the future for both the SNP and the Green Party? With the United Kingdom's general election coming up next year, give me just while I put the lights back on here, it's pretty dark where I'm sitting. How does it affect the future of both of these parties? Well, there's been some rumblings amongst senior members of the SNP about ditching the Greens, that they have been a millstone around the political neck of the SNP and have taken them down so many rabbit holes and away from their central key policy of support for independence and pushing to get independence, that it's left voters wondering what the SNP is actually for anymore, because they seem to have got used to being on the defensive for everything that has happened, every single policy, every single piece of legislation that has failed, has been passed and then shot down. They're on the defensive all the time. And if they're not on the defensive, they seem to be in denial, like nothing has happened and they're just going to carry on as before. But they can't really carry on as before for much longer, because despite what happens in the next general election next year, there's going to be a Holyrood election in 2026, and that will reveal just how much damage the failure of these central policies and legislations have actually been. What has the damage been to the SNP? We won't really tell from next year's general election, because next year's general election is to elect MPs rather than MSPs. Now, it could see the SNP losing a bit of its support. It might see some increase in Labour Party representation, but I think the media, the UK media, is playing up the whole Labour thing because they want that to happen. They want that to be the case. They want Scotland to be voting Labour instead of SNP, but that may not actually happen. It could well be that SNP support strengthens during the general election because there isn't any other independence party which has the same weight, the same heft, the same ability to campaign as the SNP. Now, those of us who have watched the growth of Alba recently might be thinking that, well, given a couple of years, a lot of things can happen in the next 2 years, and that might change the fortunes of Alba when it comes to the Scottish elections in 2026. And that's very true. The week being a long time in politics, well, imagine what it's going to be like when you've got 112 weeks for things to change in Scottish politics. After the next general election, we've got to wait till 2026. Alex Salmond, incidentally, is still pressing his legal case to sue the Scottish Government for damages against what he saw as a malicious attempt to discredit him when he was charged with, well, what can only be serious criminal acts when he was First Minister. Now, we know that he was acquitted on all charges, except for one, which I think was found not proven. But on the other hand, the way in which he was attacked and vilified, and the way that his reputation was dragged through the press, and so many things were leaked through the press before his court appearance, and the fact that even reporting his own defence strategy became an offence and people were being arrested for reporting it, there is something wrong here when a former First Minister who is an SNP leader is having to sue his own Scottish Government over an attack, a personal attack on him several years ago, which was unsuccessful. You have to wonder how much money has been wasted fighting things in the court which were never ever possible to win, because the British government always has the whip hand. That is basically what devolution is about. Scotland is not permitted to do anything substantive at all without the OK of the rest of the United Kingdom's government, which of course it never gets. And this, let's say the London government spends most of its time looking for ways to attack the Scottish government. And the Scottish government has given them lots and lots of different ways of attacking them, because it's followed all of these pieces of legislation, got them through Holyrood, only to find them either attacked by the Tory government in London and struck down, as has been the case with the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, or they've simply fallen by the wayside because they're impractical, unfeasible, or just simply damaging to the Scottish economy and local authorities. So there is a great deal of, I would say, firefighting to be done by the SNP to try and get its reputation back, and to try to get people back behind the party and actually focused again on the raison d'etre of the SNP, which is to get Scottish independence. It's not to change gender reform legislation. It's not to change the bills about dredging for scallops. It's not about fracking. It's not about anything of a minor sort. These are all diversions which have basically sapped the energy and sapped the resources of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government, which has spent a fortune in public money fighting against the English Government, which was always going to win. Frankly, I think, if nothing else, this has demonstrated just why devolution is such a trap. It's something you cannot get out of. It's something the Scottish Government cannot beat. And therefore, why does it even bother? Well, the answer to that, I think, lies in the fact that so many Scottish MSPs from the SNP and the Green Party, their entire political future is tied to staying in office as long as possible, no matter what happens and no matter whether they get sidetracked away from fighting for independence or not. And that is always a battle which is not going to be won by the independence cause, because people's self-interest will always overcome their altruistic view of Scotland being free, because we have a lot of careerist politicians, people who have never done anything else except being politicians. Maybe it's time that things change. In fact, I wouldn't say maybe, it's definitely time that things changed, and it's certainly time that the SNP stopped sticking its head in the sand and hoping everything would go away, and actually dealt with some of the problems that it's created for itself. Perhaps dropping their support for the Greens and looking for a different partner might actually help them. Who knows? But there is a chance that we could see a Scottish, an SNP-led coalition of some kind for the next general election, but who knows? They seem absolutely dead set against doing deals with anybody who might even be able to help them. But an SNP-ALBA combination for the next general election could be a way of proving the system might work for any general election, including the one at Holyrood. If you imagine that ALBA and the SNP ran together on an agreement to stand different candidates in different places, but not to step on each other's toes, we could have a Scottish government which was entirely elected and with nobody having to be co-opted in or no agreements with other parties necessary. It would be fairly simple to do. But, like I say, it all depends on the SNP changing its ways and looking for new allies who share the same goals as the SNP. I think the Greens' primary goal was to get a lot of legislation enacted which was worthy, but perhaps timed badly, or in the case of the Gender Recognition Reform Act, which, let's face it, it only deals with a very, very tiny minority of people living in Scotland. The trans community is very small. And they've always had the right to change their gender even before this act was amended. It's just they needed to provide some proof that they actually had body dysmorphia before it could be done. Now that seems reasonable to most of us, that, you know, if you need to change your gender and you're looking for permission to be able to use safe spaces with women, that you have to prove that you have body dysmorphia before they will allow you to do that. Otherwise, that safety net that protects women and girls in their own safe spaces would be gone, and you can understand why they would feel unsafe. So, looking at this in the round, something needs to change within the SNP party itself. And at the moment, under the current administration of Humza Yousaf, who is basically a continuity leader, he is a Sturgeonite. Let's face it, he is basically doing the same things that Nicola Sturgeon did, and he's added a few more extra rabbit holes to distract everybody's attention. Notably, I think his involvement, and I wouldn't want to put it any stronger than that, his involvement in what was happening in Israel and in the Gaza Strip. Now, I understand that Humza Yousaf has family members who were trapped there, and I can understand why he was concerned and how he did get involved in it publicly. But again, there is a distraction in that as well. International politics is something which the Scottish Government could get much more involved in if we were independent and the people of Scotland backed such moves. But at the moment, Humza Yousaf's involvement in this is a distraction, albeit an unintended one. And perhaps looking for a new leader who doesn't have those distractions may be one of the answers, or one of the parts of the answers to the SNP sorting itself out before the next general election. But it's finding that leader. We've also had Kate Forbes weighing into the Gender Recognition Reform Act arguments as well online, and it's well known that Ms Forbes has a very fundamental religious belief which would put her very firmly on the side of women and girls. And so even Kate Forbes would probably not be ideal leadership material if Humza Yousaf were to stand down. We've been looking for somebody who stands in a very secular part of the spectrum, who is capable of seeing things as they are and not with any kind of religious bias whatsoever. And at the moment, the leadership of the SNP does not have that kind of centre ground, either politically or religiously, and it's always wise to keep religion out of politics at all times. Anyway, these are just my observations at the moment, but it seems to me that the SNP has got a lot of work to do to repair its reputation, and it really needs to have a clear out of the kinds of people who have been making these silly decisions. And I'm talking about primarily the Green Party, and whichever ministers or SNP ministers went along with these rabbit hole type pieces of legislation, which have basically distracted the whole government from its actual reason for existing in the first place, which is to serve the people of Scotland, and in the case of an SNP administration, to push for independence using whatever means it deems necessary. And since all the doors have been shut legally by the United Kingdom, there's no way that the Scottish Parliament can look for independence. And that means that the SNP needs to start looking further afield and outside of the United Kingdom for support in its battle to free Scotland from its current situation. And this is why organisations like Salvo and Liberation Scotland are so important, because they are the ones who have started the groundwork on the legal battles that are going to be needing to be fought in the future in foreign courts, in international courts, to establish Scotland's right to free itself from this union and not to have everything dictated to it from London. Anyway, that's it for me today. I'm sorry about the vertical nature of this programme today. I'll see if I can find an older version of Facebook that I can reinstall so that you can see me in glorious landscape as you used to do. But in the meantime, remember to keep the faith. And faith is important politically at the moment for us, because this is a long road that we're on, waiting for the SNP to basically clean the house and get its act back in order before we can start fighting again with any kind of political heft whatsoever. But if they don't do it, I see that Alba is going to be basically coming up the outside and the home straight when it comes to the Scottish general elections in 2026, because if the SNP doesn't change soon, then somebody is going to come along and replace them who will do the task of getting independence. So let's see what happens. We live in interesting times. Unfortunately, we also live in frustrating and depressing times, but they don't last forever. But if we don't stay focused and keep the faith and stay the course, we're not going to make it. Remember, people who quit don't win. Winners never quit and quitters never win. It's an old adage, but it's certainly true in politics. If you survive long enough and you keep the faith long enough and your support builds and is solid, then you end up winning. And that's really what we need to remember here. Anyway, I will see you soon. Hopefully I will try and sort out a better version of Facebook live stream for you. If I can't, then, well, I might move to YouTube instead. Facebook is getting so silly these days. It's really difficult to operate on here anymore. But I'll keep you posted. If there's anything happening with YouTube, I will let you know well in advance. That's it from me today. I'll see you all again sometime in the next few days. But don't forget to, if you can afford to keep donating. It's helping me make programs. And at the moment, times are hard. You know, prices are high. Everything is expensive for all of us. So if you've got a couple of quid to spare and you can fire it my way, thank you. I'd appreciate it. Even tiny amounts add up. That's it from IndyCar. I'll catch you again in a couple of days' time. Bye-bye for now.